still planning to going?
Yes, that's what I meant by my struggle is I could walk to, if I get a bike built, I could ride there, ride right to the city limits, leave the bike there and go. Hitchhike 1,500 kilometers, I think it is, up north. I think if I really put my faith into it, which I'm trying to do with everything, like this whole community is what I'm doing, trying to keep my faith, not get uptight or not struggle too hard against it or with it, and I'm not getting anywhere. So if I put that faith into like walking to the road and hoping for a ride, I'd probably get one all the way, one way, wouldn't I? And then I'd be there, and I'd go directly into, I like living in a nice house and watching after my son, I think.
met you May 25th, it was a gift. When I seen that first side of you, my life was adrift. I went from being a kid to raising a kid, and trying not to make the same mistakes my own father did. Me and your moms, yeah, we was happy for a minute, and it hurts to tell the story, I don't want to get into it. Let's just say that there was hospitals, detectives, and news crews. I figured your dad should at least tell you the news. But then we gone past that, single for the fast track, 2 months in court, now it's you and me and that's that. It's funny how the system works. Pay back for every time that made your dead system hurt. See, that's what I said, man. I had to go against the grain to say me and my baby boy will never be a part of game. My friends know I'm not perfect. I know that I try. Long as you know, son, I'll always be here right by your side.
Imagine, if you would, visitors coming over to your house and the visitors getting comfortable in your house. Next thing you know, the visitors put you in the closet in your own house. Well, that's our existence here in Canada. We're in the closet, but it's time for us to come out. And it's time for us to tell our stories. And I'm glad that you're making this documentary so that we can share the truth with our Euro relations. You know, the time for true reconciliation has to happen. But as long as those mythologies are out there, those ideologies, we're not going to have the truth.
The similarities between what happened in residential school and what is happening now are just staggering.
And then I just kept running away, and they put me in like 17, 18 different foster homes.
You know, they say the 60s scoop, but it was actually like probably still going on today where they're, you know, Native kids are placed in non-Native homes, and that's changing.
My grandpa always said kids come first. Don't ever give up on kids, even when we're eating. He'd feed us kids first. He wouldn't feed no adults, always kids first. Kids are first ones to eat. So I grew up believing that strongly, that no matter what, a kid always comes first.
Eventually I ended up in a youth assessment center and young offender center, provincial, and federal. I went, you know, the whole system. I just went right through the whole system, right from foster. It escalated all the way from theft to manslaughter. And I'm a survivor. I'm lucky to be here today.
And she fell apart right there. I don't want to go. And she started crying. And she fell against me and she goes, I just want to be with my daddy. I just want to just leave us alone.
They don't understand the bond that we have with our children. And they don't understand that they're breaking the law, a sacred law, one of the first laws that the Creator has given us, and that law is sagituin. And when we're given that gift of life, those new children, they come with that gift of sagituin, and we're supposed to love each other, the parent and the child.
Even at the height of the residential schools, we have more children in care now than we did back then. So that principle of apprehension is still very much alive.
Just a few months ago, I was so honored to attend at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing here in Edmonton. And you can't even put into words the stories. Like the words, the words weren't the important thing. It was the spirit coming from those people sharing those stories about the horrors that happened to them when they were children. And I also saw the government people stand up and say, we're sorry, and we're going to make things better. It was just 4 days after that I walked into the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal hearings in Ottawa, where Canada is on trial for its contemporary treatment of First Nations children because they provide inequitable and flawed child welfare funding on reserves that's contributing to mass removals in numbers that outstrip residential schools.
Well, in the spirit of treaties, people think that Indigenous people were a bunch of lawless savages due to Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan, where he articulates a state of nature where life is short, brutish, and marked by scarcity and war, and basically ends in death. Well, Hobbes got run out of France and England so many times that he didn't know where he was from, and finally he had to proclaim to royalty, the royal courts, that this state of nature that he articulated never happened in Europe, but it was only in the New World that the state of nature had come about. One peculiar thing about this theory of Hobbes is Hobbes never came to the New World, so he never seen a single Indian in his life.
One of the things we filed at the tribunal is I have a warrant in my office. It's dated 1895, and it is got a cover letter written by Duncan Campbell Scott, then the acting superintendent of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. And he's writing to the Department of Justice, and he wants a warrant drafted up so he can remove Indian children and place them in residential schools, not only for education purposes, which we all know was assimilation purposes, it wasn't education, but also because the children were not properly cared for. And that's the story of residential schools a lot of people don't know, is that they were as much child welfare placements as they were schools. And in fact, by 1967, we know from a guy named Caldwell, who was a social worker in Saskatchewan, that 80% of the children who were removed and placed in residential schools at that time were placed there because of child welfare reasons. And social workers did a couple of things during the residential school period. Number one, they never, to my knowledge, ever investigated one of the numerous public complaints of deaths or maltreatment. For some reason, they just didn't do their job on that. And then the second thing is they started to serve actively on these removal committees on residential schools, the not properly cared for children. And then we got involved in child welfare. So child welfare starts ramping up in the 1950s as residential schools are slowly closing. And so you have this two-system period of removal. And I imagine many of the men that you spoke to both were in residential school and then affected themselves by child welfare and then had their own children affected by child welfare and so on down the line, right? And we hear then about the 60s scoop, where you had primarily white social workers with no understanding of Aboriginal peoples whatsoever, walking into these communities and mass removing children.
Well, if I put on my Western way of looking at things, they'll say it's a protection issue. Something has caused a child to be in need of protection. That would be the number one. If I put on my Aboriginal way of looking at things, if I look at it through an Aboriginal paradigm or an Aboriginal lens, however you want to phrase it, it would be the intergenerational trauma that a family is experiencing.
You know, I don't think we've really come too far from residential schools. Every day I shake my head. I hear about the residential schools and this wonderful, whatever we're doing, this wonderful stuff that's happening over residential schools, but I don't see the results in my daily work as much as I would like to.
My first experience with child welfare was probably the day I was born. I was apprehended. This is what I'm told by my older sister. I was apprehended and placed directly into foster care. And I wasn't adopted until 18 months. So that first year and a half of my life, I'm sure I have memories of it, but I haven't been able to access them, and I don't have any way of knowing what happened in that first year and a half.
First time I guess I've been involved was when I was 18 months old. I was part of the 60s scoop, me and my older brothers, I'm the youngest of my family, and we were put in different foster homes, and finally they found a permanent one for us, and they were from the Netherlands, Holland. It was a very abusive home.
I was about 9 years old and I went to school one day and I had these big welts on the back of my back, because that woman, she had beat me with a linoleum from the stairs. There's some linoleum, it's about that thick. And she beat me with that, and I had that on my back and all over. And I took off my shirt at track and field because I just loved to run. And I took off my shirt and I just totally forgot about that beating I got the night before. And I was jogging and I was getting ready to run, and that Miss Peterson, her grade 1 teacher, she comes over and she says, "Trevor, put your shirt back on. I want to talk to you." So she takes me to the office and asks me, and here I lied for those people. I never knew I was a foster kid. I never knew, I thought this was normal. I thought being beat on like this was normal.
When it came to exposing that to the workers, I remember when I was about 7, 8 years old, it was after the incidents that started happening that I was trying to tell them. But when it came for the social worker to come see us, we were coached on what to say, and then we were shuffled off while they had their own private meeting with them. So I didn't really have a chance. I didn't know how to say anything to them because I was scared.
I got found out about, the abuse that was going on in that home because of that track and field day. And after that, I went to numerous foster homes, and there was no, I didn't stick around in a foster home long enough for them to abuse me or anything. I would just run away because the first foster home they took me to, they left me there and they took my brothers and my sister, and they just left me there. And I was just watching the social services lady drive away.
As I believe in kids shouldn't be in homes. I was in a home myself, and I got abused in that home. It was, and I never thought nuns would ever abuse kids, but I guess they do.
Culture didn't mean nothing to them at all. No matter how many times he tried to get me back, they wouldn't let him. They'd say I was better off with my mom, but I wasn't.
But while that's happening, we'll be looking at this home and we'll be seeing how these parents, foster parents, are looking after the kids. Because from my experience, was their sexual, physical, mental, emotional abuse, what they got away with because they were pillars in the community. Nobody even thought of that would be happening in the home.
I know these social services workers, their names, both of them, they're two sisters. And I remember vividly what they looked like. I remember their vehicle that they were driving in. And I remember I seen them in Wetaskiwin one time, and I was drunk, and when I was 18, and I just went right off, right in the middle of the road, right in the street, you know. I was like, you guys fucked me up for life, and now look at how I'm fucked up because of you, and you guys, why the fuck do you know? I just went right off on them, and they were totally ignorant as to what, you know, Aboriginal was. Like, they don't, you know, Native, they don't know anything.
Like today, if I was to get hit with a sledgehammer on my head, I wouldn't probably feel it because I desensitized myself from pain, you know. After a while, I just used to let her beat me to the point where I get it over with, you know. And what really made her mad was I quit crying, and I used to just tell her, go ahead, just get it over it, beat me. You know, do what you gotta do. And then I take off to my dad, go show him. He said, well, you're not going anywhere. And the last time those cops came, and they left without me, after my dad said, look, and he was crying, look what my ex-wife did to my son, and you guys don't listen to him.
I stayed with my mom and everything, but she was abusive too, so I got it all over. And like he said, it got to a point where it hit you, you know, teachers hit you, principals hit you, your mother hits you, you become numb. I got scars all over, I don't even know where they come from. And I coped with that because I felt their pain, I guess. I felt sorry for them when I was 13 because they couldn't make me cry. I broke a nose, big gash in my head, concussions.
And I started learning about that there's this whole other realm to my identity that I had no idea about, the residential schools, about the politics and the history and all that I learned. I basically had to teach myself this about all the potential, I guess, that was there just under the surface of what was being shown as the reality for our people.
Doctors are getting paid because I was, you know, going, of course, need medical attention sometimes, you know. Everyone's getting paid, you know, while my mom and dad were hurting, you know, and nobody's there to help them. Took their kids, and you know what? That's it. That's not right.
Oh, it's definitely Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish survivor of the Nazi Holocaust, is the one that coined the phrase genocide back in 1949. And they had a genocide convention that most of the world signed on to, except for Canada. Canada didn't sign on to it until 1951 with revisions. And there's five articles of genocide, and Canada is guilty of each one of those articles. So we've had a Holocaust here that continues to go on. Only the genocide that's happening here is a genocide between velvet sheets, where you don't realize a genocide is happening upon you, because it's like some people call it the frog in water, where they'll turn up the heat a little bit, turn up the heat a little bit. Pretty soon the frog is in boiling water and it's cooked. That's us. We don't realize that until people can come to terms and become educated. Not just our people, but mainstream society too has to take ownership and accountability to what they've done to our people. They always talk about the victims taking accountability and being more realistic about what has happened. But what about the people that actually did the behaviors to us, that gave us the residential schools, that gave us the 60 scoops, that gave us the dependency syndrome on welfare? Because prior to that, we were functioning people, very well functioning.
I just came from the Truth and Reconciliation Education Day in Toronto with 2,200 teenagers, and I'm still standing, so I think that's pretty good. But one of the people that was invited there was a Holocaust survivor. And he was sharing his own learning journey about what was happening with First Nations people here in Canada. And I think his message was really clear, is that it's not about taking away from the horrors that happened to Jewish persons and other persons during the Second World War in the Holocaust. To say that there is a grave injustice happening to another people that must be addressed. It's genocide, it's whatever you want to call it, it is fundamentally wrong. He said it's actually an honoring of the teachings of those who suffered, to understand what happened in the Holocaust, not just the tragedies of the millions who died, but why it happened. Germany was a very well-developed country. It had many bright people. It had a lot of economic power. Like, what came together that allowed that horrible, horrible thing to happen? And that's what we also need to understand about residential schools. Why, what thinking was available that allowed it to happen and allows it, I argue, to continue. So I think that's the important message. And I think that he has it absolutely right, is that we dishonor those who have suffered by not learning from their experience and doing what we can for all people to make sure it doesn't happen again. You know, paper really can take your breath away, right? And there was this big spreadsheet by Aboriginal Affairs, and it had all the First Nations children on reserve and in the Yukon Territory who were in foster care between 1989 and 2012. And it counted the number of days. So we think about these little kids, we think about, well, some go into child welfare care for an evening and some go in for the rest of their childhood. So when you add up all those days together, those sleeps as kids would call them, what does it look like? 66 million nights of childhood being spent away from their families and communities, which means 187,000 years. That's what we're losing right now.
Why is there disproportionate numbers of apprehension with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal?
I think that's a very complex question we ask, and it's probably the one that's asked the most because we have numbers that are thrown around, like 70% of all the kids in care are Aboriginal. So there's a number of reasons, and I think some of that is attributed to lack of knowledge of child welfare workers, children youth services workers about Aboriginal issues in general. So they're not familiar with things like intergenerational trauma or residential schools, and so they don't ask those kinds of questions. They never get to the root of the problem, and so for them to go and find a solution if they don't know what the real issue is, it's not going to happen.
Have a trial of the evidence as to what really happened necessarily in there, but we have the man, arrested, perhaps facing criminal charges. I've had so many men facing criminal charges as against their children and have no contact provisions then against their children for a year or two, and when they're finally able to get rid of those charges against them, some through trial, winning at trial, then they haven't seen their kids for a year or two. And everyone around their kids believes that that's their fault. And so they had no way of seeing their kid for a year or two. The child doesn't know why dad hasn't been there. The relationship with the child is affected because a child, I mean, my father was God of all in my eyes when I was a child. So if he hadn't shown up back at home sometime, then it must be something to do with me, or, you know. And so you can imagine how those children are feeling when dad then doesn't see them for a long time, and they can understand why. They hear people probably talking about scary dad. They hear child welfare talking to mom about keep him away, or they saw the police take him away, but they never get to sit down with dad and say, but don't you still love me? Right? They never get to say that. And so that father never gets to tell them, yes, I do.
I think our case work practice, the way that we do social work, historically, regardless of a person's nationality or ancestry, we historically have not engaged men. We tend to focus on the mother, and they are usually seen as the only option for the child, and we focus on the father as the problem. And so until we stop looking at things as a problem, we're gonna see change being slow. And so I think those are the barriers that you're talking about engaging a father. We can't engage them if we look at them as the problem. And what happens when we take that approach is that we only focus on the negative, or what we perceive to be the negative. Sometimes we operate not on fact, but on third-hand information. And so it becomes difficult for fathers or men in general within the Aboriginal community to overcome those stereotypes of being the problem, to becoming a valued person at the table, a viable option for looking after children.
Over the years, before even talking with child services, we never trusted them already because we never really knew what they were. We just heard negative stories about them. They just take kids away. They don't really do anything for you and all this and that, so we didn't trust them off the bat, right?
Anyways, I was walking home, and it was like 5 a.m, Sunday morning, and I was almost home, and the cops pulled me over. Where are you going? They got out and asked me, oh, you look suspicious, like somebody you were looking for. Remind you, it's not the first time they told me that. And I said, oh. So they put me in a vehicle, because I was like, okay, and they started asking me questions. Where are you going? I said, I'm going home. And they're like, oh yeah, well, what's going on? I said, well, I just got drunk, I'm just on my way home, sobering up. It was a long walk from Chateau Louis to Castle Downs, so I was quite sobered up. Not sobered up, but I was walking it off. And he said, they asked me a question about my kids. I said, oh, they're at the babysitters. I had got my cousin to watch my kids while I went out for the weekend. So the next thing I knew, I was at her place. And then I was like, what? What's going on here? Then they went into the house. I was handcuffed and everything. And next thing I seen them pulling my kids from the babysitter's house.
I come back from my walk, and all of a sudden there's my baby mama sitting on the steps crying, and I'm like, well, what's going on? And then she started crying, telling me she took him, and then I'm like, what? And I was like in a state of shock, because all of a sudden, next thing you know, her mom appears out of nowhere and starts blaming everything on me, getting mad at me and putting it all on me. All of a sudden, it's your fault, it's your fault. I'm like, what? Like, I didn't even realize what the hell just happened. All of a sudden, my son was taken away. Then I asked her to finally explain the story to me and tell me what happened, what was going on. I guess they showed up with police and asked to see my son, and there was like nothing going wrong with the house. Everything was peaceful there. And they're like, why? And nobody trusted them. So they're like, well, why are you guys here? They're like, we just want to see your son. We just want to look at him. And they're like, okay, well, here he is. He's sleeping. He's okay. They're like, yeah, okay, well, can I see him? And then the woman picks him up. And I guess they're just like, okay, now I have to apprehend him. And they're like, what? And then they just took my son just like that.
just before I left, the social workers came and met me in the detox center, and it was the first time she'd ever met me. And I talked to her, and she's like, "You're not the guy that is talking about." What do you mean? She's like literally, this isn't even your name that she's given us, and the stuff she's telling us doesn't really jive with what I'm seeing here.
I could see him in the mirror, and I was like, "What are you guys doing taking my kids for?" And they uncuffed me, took me out, uncuffed me, told me to run. If I could get away from them, I could get let go. And I tried. I made it maybe 2 feet. And the next thing you knew, I was hogtied.
So I promised myself and my son that I was going to give him the father that I never had, because I never had no father. So them taking them away kind of just destroyed us, and then it left me and my baby mama for a few years spiraling out of control, trying to figure out what's going on, what do we do, and why did they do this to us. And then we just became really, they were labeling us as alcoholics and drug addicts and are violent and all this stuff like that is what they were saying is a so-called purpose. But we weren't even like that until after they took my son. Afterwards, that's when we kind of fell apart. Then we had to catch ourselves and figure out how to gain control and how to figure it all out, to understand why they even did this to us. Because they didn't give us a chance to be parents. They just took him. And then when our second son was born, they took him right from the hospital. We only got to spend the night with him. So again, another chance at being a parent took him straight from the hospital this time though.
Well, what am I going to do? Do I stay here and try and find a place and get on child welfare and then go for custody, or I was thinking it was going to be a long drawn out process, and said I can't stay here. She would do crazy stuff like call her friends and tell them I was beating her up and try and get me beat up and stuff. So I had to leave Whitehorse and I came here, and I thought, okay, this is probably going to end up in court. At the very least, I'm going to have to get my life together and then apply to get a lawyer and go up there and fight her in court for custody or whatever. And that was super disheartening. I thought, that's going to take forever.
When they wouldn't help me with food or anything, or money, or welfare, me and my kids, we'd go out, we'd go picking bottles, I started trying meat and everything. I was getting ready for child welfare to come because they were coming to apprehend my kids that day, like they told me, because I couldn't feed them. So when they got there, I had moose legs and all that from cutting all the meat, and they seen it was moose bones and that, because I was just finished cutting up all the meat and bringing them out. So I opened my deep freeze and I showed them all the moose meat in the deep freeze and a freezer and a fridge, and whatever I couldn't freeze, I dried. I had my smokehouse going, and I said, "Do you like some meat?" And
I'm trying, my hardest to be a father to my children. I keep my little grandson now, and I keep my other 2 grandchildren. I do have one grandson who's in the system right now, and he's in the same situation as I was when, he was just thrust into nobody wanted him, so they gave him to the system. And I'm working on getting him out of the system. And I just had a meeting last week with the social services, and I told them my story about what I went through, and I'm trying to be there for my kids today because they never had a father, and I'm trying to be there, be their dad and stuff.
So how it works is, I was a child protection worker for 13 years. So how it works is child welfare can only get involved if someone makes a referral. You can self-refer as a parent. Many parents do get the support. They just realize they're at that point and they need some help. Or you can be referred by a nurse or a doctor or even another patient. Yeah. So when we receive a report, so if you're me as a child protection worker, you have to receive all incoming reports. And then you do what's called an assessment. So what that is Like I worked in the downtown east side, so I would get calls from some of the rich Vancouverites saying, there's a kid who comes to school every day with peanut butter sandwiches. And I said, that's a very nutritious meal on welfare. That is not a child protection complaint. Closed. And then there's some where you might have some more questions about. You just don't have enough information to know one way or the other. So you get on your computer and you do a review to see if there's been any prior contact. They call it a prior contact check with child welfare. And if, depending on the nature of the complaint, like say, like you get a whole range of them, right? It might be, well, we're a little bit concerned with the way this young mom is interacting with her child. During the social history, she told us that she used to use substances. We can't see anything right now, but we're concerned, right? So you would go in there and you would do some contact checks. You would speak to her about where things are at, just to make sure the child is safe. But if it's something like, you know, the child has got broken bones, is in the hospital, then you're going to move on that very quickly. And, you know, you'll want those x-rays and those other things, and you may involve the police, because then it's also a criminal charge. So sexual abuse or physical abuse are criminal charges. So you bring it in that way. And then at the end of that, you either substantiate or not substantiate the complaint.
Men, I find, Aboriginal fathers in that area, very limited, if any, resources available for them. and certainly not much help coming from Children's Services either. There's not a lot of resources. There's more, go do this, go do that, go do this, but no one helped to even help them find out, where do you go do this? How do I get this service? How do I get a domestic violence program? Where do I go? Who do I call? A lot of times that just isn't there.
These things keep coming up. The little things like what you were saying, they make you to jump through more loopholes when you met their needs, and then expectations, like I expect more and more every time, right? See, that's what happened to me. I did my rehab to get my daughter back. I did all these courses, all these anger managements, because I have an anger issue, right? But I'm dealing with it. And I did all that, and now I had to sign another contract, 4 months, and which is I don't like it, but I don't want to lose my daughter, eh? Because this would be the 3rd time my daughter got apprehended, but it was always not my fault. Well, 2 times I was at camp and there was incidents. My daughter got taken away, and I did what I had to do to get my daughter back.
They brought my kids back 2 days later. And he still kept popping in, you got to go to ADAC on the safety plan thing. I said, I'm not going. I said, you're not going to label me as an alcoholic, because I'm not. I won't go to it. I said, no, I told you what happened. I was walking home, exactly what I told you. I've been telling the same story over and over. And they closed the file, and the kids stayed home, and then child maintenance kicked in. So they started garnishing my wages. They took all my money, so I stopped making the car payments. I lost our place because I couldn't pay for it. And the kids went home to their mom, and they didn't want to, but we talked, and I said, just take care of them. So I went to live on the street.
So the challenge is really in trying to figure out how we can get the benefits, the best outcome for the family, without becoming major enemies with Children's Services. It's hard to get help from someone that you're fighting. And when you're in court and you're fighting, you know, the balance between your adversary versus someone who's helping you. And when you're involved with child welfare, you're going to be a year or so while waiting to get to trial, while Children's Services tells you what you need to do. They set out what they think you need to do for them. And if you don't do it while you're waiting for a judge to tell you you need to do it, by the time you get there to trial, your chances of getting your kids back have lessened because you haven't done this stuff. So even though you have a right to go to trial, to have a judge set out for you what indeed you need to do, who is right and who is wrong in this evidentiary sort of business, and then setting out for you, if we're going to keep your kids in care, what terms, what conditions you have to meet to get your kids home, That takes, at least a year now. I guess I shouldn't say at least a year. Sometimes you can get a sooner trial. But it's going to take 6 months to a year before you get that chance. Meanwhile, you have to be answering to the people and doing what they're asking you to do. Otherwise, by the time you get to trial, they'll use your lack of response as evidence against you. So you're caught in this, don't I have a right to fight that my kid shouldn't be in care and that I was doing things right? Well, you do, but by the time you get that chance, if you haven't done what they asked you to do, then your chances actually go down. So it's a circular sort of, they're collecting evidence on you that whole time. A lot of it as to how you respond to what they're asking you to do, how you respond to the people that they put in the visits to watch you. All of these things are adding up against you to be used at trial while you're waiting for that trial so that a judge can say yes or no, you do or don't have to listen to them.
When I did removals, I remember I knew that parent was really traumatized. They're traumatized. They weren't taking in all the things I was telling them that was going to happen next. I would make it a regular practice to go back. I would say to them, I will be back tomorrow. I want you to have your COCM here or your neighbor here or someone to stay with you, because we're going to have the same conversation again. Right now, all I want you to do is to take care of yourself and get those support systems around you, because tomorrow we have to start the work of getting this child back. But not every social worker will do that. They think they've already given you the information, and so why didn't you take it in? So people need to have these very basic tools, right? So if that happens to you, then you ask the social worker back, get your, your neighbor, some trusted relative there to be there to hear the information for you. Take notes. Being a child protection worker isn't a profession. It's a cultural responsibility. I don't know, I've been so honored to be welcomed into First Nations communities across Canada and many Indigenous communities around the world. I don't know of one traditional law that would have allowed for the mistreatment of children.
In the areas of working with fathers, I think Children and Youth Services has a lot more work to do. We are starting to see some improvement in regards to services for that specific group. Agencies such as Creating Hope, Aboriginal Consulting, where we're starting to see groups specifically offered for fathers, services offered directly to fathers, because in our practice, we typically don't look at the role of men and the role of fathers as it pertains to child welfare. I think that's a historical piece, and I think for us to be able to change some of our practice and look at best practice, we need to start to focus on what fathers traditionally mean to a family and match that up to where we are at in today's culture.
Every time we try to talk with these people, they never actually give us clear answers. There's always adding stuff and saying things that what's wrong, what's so wrong with us, right? But they don't really get what's wrong with themselves, right? And seeing how they're judging us automatically when they never actually had to live the lifestyles that we had to live, And they grow up in their perfect little lives in their suburban areas, and they go to schools and whatnot, and they sit behind a desk all day and whatnot, and then they think they can just judge us on who we are. And that's how they labeled us. That was it.
And they don't teach you any of this in school, right? That's another part of it that I think the system has to. That might even be like the root where change could be affected the most is in these public school systems.
Think of the positives the person's making, and the changes they've made, and support those changes. Help them along the way. If they're getting into parenting programs, then they're having a hard time getting there, provide transportation for them. You're in a position of supporting the people. The best interest of the child is to have the mom and dad there.
I believe they have other alternatives instead of taking kids. I believe they should have homemakers, because if they can take kids from a home, I'm pretty sure they can go visit in a home from so much time to so much time. If they want to do a 1 month thing or 2 month thing would be good. Just to go to the house every day to see how the kids are living, see how the parents are living, how the families are living, because a lot of it's hard on single people. You see how tough it is to buy food and clothes and rent, power, gas. They got to see for themselves, plus kids and plus single parents. I want them to see how it is to go in their home and show them, to go stay with them. Not overnight, but come during the day, just to see how the kids are getting disciplined, to make sure there's no alcohol, drugs coming in. This way they see it from their own eyes instead of hearing it from over the phone. There's a lot of people, like these days, our native people, sometimes when you get too far ahead, they want to try to bring you down, or somebody will want to bring you down. So it's better for them to see with their own eyes how a family lives before they start taking kids.
And I'm learning all this and stuff, and then I'm realizing that, you know, how stalled our people can have gotten by the lack of education, right? By the lack of just basically honesty within the systems to share this reality with them. Like, you know, when you grow up and you don't know anything about yourself, how are you supposed to accept yourself or move forward? And how are you supposed to pass that on to your children?
Like right now, between me and my ex-wife, child services isn't involved anymore, but still there's that distancing between me and her, because she doesn't like the way I'm talking with my own daughter. And now she's on her high horse thinking, you know, I got her out of child care. Now she's living with me. I'm done smoking crack. I got a good home. I got a rich man. I can provide for her. Okay, all the kudos to you. She's out of there, but she still needs me. Okay, because that's stepdads and real dads. I'm the blood dad. I want to be there. We have a connection. And I do want her to come live with me sometime in the future. But she doesn't like that. And so I think if we build that connection, and if we had somebody who can help me with that connection, because I've been trying. I phone her and it's like, my voice to her is like fingers on a chalkboard probably.
They need to be more informed, I think. And not just to, you know, they need to more individual work on the family, not just, you know, okay, well, you know, I heard he's an alcoholic or a drug dealer, so we're going to take away his kids, you know, just because they hear that. Individually, they need to work with the families and the people, and that's, you know, that's what I believe has to happen.
Why aren't men? Why don't we see more men as the caregiver? We have lots of children in care. Could they be cared for by their fathers? Probably. Have we spent all of the time looking and making sure those are viable options? I can't say that we confidently do. But I do see practice changing. And so there are a number of initiatives that are forcing our staff to look at things in a different way. And so that goes back to the teachings about many ways of knowing.
I think we need to have, as peoples, an open and honest conversation about how we support both men and women in society. Because sometimes the conversations lately have been more about women. And I don't think that way. I think it's about the health of our entire community, and that means the health of men and the health of women and the health of our children and our elders. It needs to be part of that whole conversation. And it should never be taken as taking away from women to talk about men. Absolutely not. It's a gift to everyone that we look at the needs of our entire community and we lift everyone up.
I was invited by Creating Hope to sit with some grandmothers who were caring for their children and for their grandchildren. And even in that circle of grandmothers, they shared that the fathers are missing, and how do they engage the fathers in the raising of these children, because there are specific roles for men in the development of a child. Those kinds of concepts are a bit foreign to our workers who aren't familiar with working with Aboriginal families. And so we have a big role to provide that education and those opportunities for people to learn.
Follow protocol when you're going through the process, and stay connected to the Creator, and just get as much advice as you can.
They believe in their kids. Just go, and you talk a mile away till you get your kids back. Not to give up. As child welfare don't own us, so only God owns us, not them. We're here for ourselves, our kids, and the Creator. And I believe in, like what he said, a father will do anything, a man will do anything to protect their family. And that's what men are there for. We'll do pretty much anything, if it's to hunt, trap. If our kids are in danger, we'll have the strength of 10 men to get them out of danger.
I think that to be effective, to feel that you are making a difference, that you are being part of some sort of change, that if you're not grounded in ceremony, if you don't have that to go back to as your center point, then you're going to find it all very difficult. And we have an inherent right and responsibility to ensure that we pass that on to the families and to the children that we work with. And so if you're lacking in that area, if you don't have that knowledge, you have to go out and find it. And there are people that will share it with you willingly. It's you that has to make that step.
Those schools being discriminated against by the government of Canada and made to feel the problem was all about them. And then fast forward to 2014 and see Canada trying to defend their right to continually mistreat First Nations children in today's context. But there was something very important in those times. And the thing that has changed is not the government, it is the people. It's the fact that we as First Nations people now have the strength to take the Canadian government to court and hold them accountable. And it's the many caring non-Aboriginal people who are standing with us because they know what's going on right now is not right. That's where the hope is in this whole thing.
I strongly believe in our system of law. Notwithstanding, I see it not work a lot of times. But it can work. And if you get the right people around you, which is maybe difficult to do, but you know they are there, you just have to search really hard and not give up and understand you're not the only one. You know, there are so many other men out there and women feeling the same way and trying to find someone to help. You just need to keep knocking on those doors until you find that person. If Children's Services knocks on your door, or if you hear that they're involved with your kids, you need to get a lawyer ASAP. You should never wait on getting a lawyer. You should never wait on trying to find advocates, trying to get the help yourself rather than just going to where Children's Services says. You need to jump on board. And I know for me that would be really hard after someone took my kids to pick myself up every day and go and do something. And so I can't imagine how much harder it is for Aboriginal peoples, and especially for Aboriginal men, to do that, because when they've stood up and tried to do those things, I'm sure they've been slapped down many a times. But you just need to keep doing it. and understanding that your kids, no matter how much you hear about the kids don't want to see you or the kids don't want to come home, you know, don't believe it.
My message to you, young man, is learn how to love yourself. Learn how to accept yourself. Deal with your anger. That's the first thing I ask young men when they come to me for help. I ask them, have you dealt with your anger? Are you angry? And some of them respond in anger and they say, I'm not angry. and they get angry. That's the first thing they do. And after working with them for 4 or 5 months, 6 months, they come back to me and they said, that first thing you asked me really troubled me about anger, and I thought I was done with anger. But I realized I still had a ways to go. So you helped me. And from that initial moment to moments later when I work with young men again, they're not as hard. They don't have that protective shell on anymore. They're more open. It's about vulnerability. And how can you let spirit in if you're not vulnerable? I mean, the gateway to the spirit world, I always say, is the emotions. And us men, we have to overcome those and learn about emotion. Whereas women, they're emotional beings to start off with. I've met a lot of women that are angry because of what men have done to them. And they have every right to be. Because us men, we can be brutes. I was a brute at one time. But I've overcome that, I think. And if anyone ever watches this that I was a brute too, well, I'm sorry. And I'll apologize in person when I get that opportunity. However, I'm a family man now. I have 6 children. And they taught me about love, those children. I wish I could turn back time 20 years. My oldest one is 19. But it's never too late. It's never too late. So, young man, learn about love. Learn about your emotions. There's more than just anger there. Learn how to be vulnerable, and yet learn how to keep your heart safe.
Called Love, Dad. My baby boy, hear me and give thanks, for though this distance is yet far, and my mind's bow, weary with heavy tears, I loose these arrows of love and pride, and I trust your heart as a target, and your spirit as the balance which guides their aim, true and steadfast, across the time between us, tethering these sacrifices of lost bonding and dark city strife to the universal dream of hope's rising light. I love you, my boy.